There we go. We're good. Good evening. I'm very, very happy to be able to welcome all of you to this Jubilee year presentation on Dorothy Day that we gather together. I thank you for coming, and I thank you for being a part of this presentation. We got connected with Jeff Corrigan, who's here to do the honors for us through Ted. And Jean, and we had a great meeting, or at least our initial meeting was a wonderful meeting. Learned a lot about the work that Jeff has done on the life of Dorothy Day, and it's really, really just a great experience to be together. I did point out, but I didn't have to because Jeff already knew, that we do have one of our stained glass windows in our gathering space in the new church with Dorothy Day as one of the, and one of the few that, well, yeah, maybe the only one that's not a saint that actually got put on the stained glass window. So we're waiting. We're waiting for that to happen, and Jeff will be able to fill us in on some of on a whole host of different things. I think you're as much an expert on her as anybody that I know. So it's great, Jeff. Thank you for coming. We welcome you, and it's great to have you as a part of this presentation.
Thank you so much. And tonight's presentation is based as much on what I learned about her working for 7 years on her canonization as anything. And about 2 years into it, you know, I had a career in Catholic social justice ministry, and I was the planner in the Diocese of Metuchen, just a little bit to the south of here. And so I was working for Cardinal Dolan on her canonization, and about 2 years into it, I started thinking, this would make an amazing musical. And I went home and I told my wife, like, hey, we're gonna do a Dorothy Day musical. She said, you know you have no skills in that area, right? You think you're Lin-Manuel Miranda or something, you know? And then I started thinking, well, I've done comics, so what about a big graphic biography of Dorothy that's written for adults, but is accessible for teenagers. So, you know, could be used in a Catholic high school or something like that. And I started talking with some friends that I had done some comics on worker justice and on immigration. And these were artists, and they said, oh, you have to meet this guy, Christopher Cardinale, because he has the style. He's very into historical stuff. He's got a specialty in 1930s sign painting. You know, I didn't even know that was a specialty. So, you know, he's really got the historical eye. And so Christopher and I got together and we started talking about it. And he, you know, read up on Dorothy Day. He knew about her, but not a lot. And so we started talking about how we might do this. We brought in a Franciscan friar to kind of help us with some of the more churchy things. Like, I'm 32 years in pastoral ministry, but, you know, I wouldn't know if the habits are wrong, you know, on the sisters, you know, so he was really helpful with that. So we got started, and 8 years later, we have this book, which Paulist Press, it was the 4th largest selling book for them in 2024, and it came out Labor Day. So it did pretty well. People are getting into it. We just try to convince people this is an adult book that's accessible for kids. So it's not like you're buying old Looney Tunes or something like that. So I wanted to start by asking folks a little bit about your own impressions of Dorothy. Who is Dorothy Day to you? Anyone have an impression of her? Who's Dorothy Day? You know, someone says, why is Doris Day on our actual quote I've heard from your pastor? Yes. She comforted the afflicted and afflicted the comfortable, which actually is a motto of journalism. And she was one of the great journalists of the 20th century. She had her own newspaper. Anybody else? Yes. So read in a series on church women. Oh, okay. Women's history. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of challenges, and we'll get into that. Let's take one more. Any impression of Dorothy Day? What's that? Heroic figure. Yeah, we'll talk about heroic virtue in a minute when we talk about the sainthood process. Yeah. Yeah, she wasn't always where's the card? I I call this the grandma Dorothy picture. You know, she wasn't always the saintly looking woman who, you know, affirmed young people in their work for justice. She was you know, when she started the Catholic Workers, she was 35. You know, one of her Catholic workers, longtime Catholic workers, Stanley Wisniewski said, you know, I got involved because I saw this old lady trying to carry a typewriter across the street, and I helped her carry it, you know, and Dorothy was 35, you know, at the time, but he was 17. So he stayed until his death when he was in his 60s, but he always used to say, yeah, I've been here since I was 17, but I haven't decided whether I'm going to stay or not. But those are some of the characters. You know, the fun part of the canonization was meeting people that knew her very well, and also learning about some of these other people that spent their whole life at the Catholic Worker, you know, building up the movement. But there's always a question of, well, where do we begin Dorothy's story? You know, do we begin it, you know, like the movie, you know, Entertaining Angels, where she's being beaten up by sailors for protesting for suffrage? And we said, no, let's go a little earlier, because there's a very formative event in her life, which is in 1906 in San Francisco, the great San Francisco earthquake. Dorothy Day was there for that. You know, the people of San Francisco who lived in Chinatown were the first to notice something was wrong. At about 5:12 in the morning, the cathedral bells started ringing. You imagine that? It really freaked people out. And then a minute later, the earth opened up. And then a few minutes like after that, all the buildings caught fire. This is a city made of wood. They've lit the fires for the day, and the earthquake knocks down the walls, and suddenly the whole city's on fire. Now, back in Oakland, John Day and his wife, Grace, they lived in Oakland. They were new residents. John Day was the most popular sports writer for the most popular sport in the United States at the time. Anyone know what that would be? Not baseball. Close. Not football. Not soccer. No, definitely not soccer. What's that? Boxing? No, but that's another one that's pretty close. Anybody remember? Not cricket, no. Horse racing. Yeah, everyone always says, oh, yeah, of course. I saw Seabiscuit, you know, that John Day is a very outstanding writer, newspaper writer, and all his kids want to be journalists. And they're in Oakland. The earthquake wakes them up. They're asleep. The mom and dad say, Dad says, earthquake, I'll get the boys. Mom says, I'll get the baby. They get outside, and they say, where's Dorothy? You know, if you're a parent, you may have had moments like that. They get outside and Dorothy's not there. And so I always go back to that as formative, because is it any surprise that a person who had so much interest and care for people left behind in our society got left behind during one of the great natural disasters of American history? So I kind of begin it there. But it wasn't just the trauma of the earthquake. It was also seeing the relief efforts. People streamed in, on boats, however they could, from San Francisco into Oakland, and the people of Oakland took care of these refugees from the earthquake. And in this picture, this is a full page, and we have all of the corporal works of mercy, because Dorothy saw people responding with the corporal works of mercy, and particularly two kinds of organizations, unions and churches. No big government help, no FEMA. It was just unions and churches that organized to help people. And so for the rest of her life, she really believed that it was the duty of unions and churches to respond to the problem of poverty, not big government. She actually wrote an editorial against Social Security in the 1930s because she believed it was a province of all Christians that, Jesus calls us to. I was hungry and you gave me food. Well, give them food. That is a responsibility of Christians and all of us who call ourselves Christian. There's a great quote here that she told her mom, and this has been documented many times. She says, "Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time?" You imagine that little girl, she's born in 1897, so she's like about 9 years old at that point. Imagine seeing all that and then saying, "Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time?" So we do a time jump to 1916. It's 10 years later, and 19-year-old Dorothy Day wants to be a journalist like her father and her two older brothers. But she wants to be a journalist, not about horse racing, but for the people, for people living in poverty, for workers. And she lands in New York, but her dad has told her, newspapers, no place for a girl. Newspapers, no place for a girl. And she goes for interviews all over New York with the major papers, and all the editors say the same thing. Newspapers, no place for a girl. The exact words her father told her, to the point where she wondered if her dad had called these editors, because remember, he's a very prominent journalist. They'll return his phone call. And she starts to think, okay, maybe Pop has called all these editors. Well, Pop did not call the editors of the socialist papers. And so she talks herself into a job, not a very high-paying job, but a job where she can be a journalist on behalf of the poor. And it's a newspaper called the New York Call. And one of the things I've learned about these papers and about these movements is that you had, like, on the same paper, anarchists who believe in no government and socialists who believe a strong role for government and owning major industries, and future communists who believe in government control of so much. So these people are not all the same ideologies. So they stay up late at night drinking beer, arguing with each other about once they've destroyed capitalism, what are they going to build? And Dorothy finds a niche for herself as a reporter in getting to know the ordinary lives of women and children living in poverty. And here she's interviewing an Italian woman. "Miss Salvatore, you say your family eats dog food to get by? I used to cook up chicken feet for the dog, but now we have to eat them ourselves. We have 6 children. It's not so bad if you cut the nails off and boil them for a long time." And then that becomes this article over here. It may be hard to see. This is a little swirling of all the articles, some of the articles she wrote for the New York Call. Mr. J.D. Rockefeller, 26 Broadway, which is a lot like saying Elon Musk today, the richest man in the world, Rockefeller. Here's a family living on dog food. And so you see in the headlines, you remember reading in American history about muckraking. This is a style of journalism, just going for people's gut and trying to have people have a feeling of compassion for the people who are suffering, both the poorest of the poor, but also just ordinary workers who just can't seem to be able to put anything much more than chicken feet on the table. So Dorothy really begins to love this life. She's finally a journalist. She's writing on behalf of low-income people. But there is a fellow staffer named Lewis who I would guess is mentally ill. Dorothy's best friend um, described him as cuckoo as a boiled owl. And some of these 100-year-old expressions don't really, carry, but it sounds like he was mentally ill, and he was in love with Dorothy. And he just kept pestering her for dates. She kept saying no. And one day he goes to give her a big hug at one of these. They would have these dances to raise bail money for people who had been arrested in their movements, and sometimes at Tammany Hall itself. And Lewis goes up to give her a big hug, and Dorothy smacks him, knocks off his glasses. And the next day, her editor says, "You've got to apologize to Lewis. You can't hit other reporters." And she said, "He keeps pestering me for dates. I keep saying no, and he keeps bothering me." Today we call that sexual harassment in the workplace. Back then, it was her fault. And by the way, this is before she became a pacifist, that she hit him. Well, a friend of hers, Mary Heaton Vorse, who works for a magazine called The Masses. If you remember that movie long ago, Oscar-winning movie Reds, with Warren Beatty, that's about the masses. And Dorothy isn't in that movie, but she works with them as an editorial assistant. She helps write some book reviews and works on all the production you have to do to put out a magazine. And one of her editors takes her aside one day and says, "We're about to get arrested because we have in the magazine come out publicly against the Great War, which we know now as World War I. And people right now are concerned about some of the directions in our country." Well, to give you an idea of 100 years ago, you would be put in jail for publicly opposing a war that the United States was in. And are we going back to that, or did we learn something from that? We're going to find out. Dorothy is asked to put out the last issue. So she goes and gets trained with the printers, and she actually puts it out. The editors are all put in prison. Soon after that, she's unemployed, and a friend says, "Hey, I'm going to go down to D.C. to protest for women's suffrage. You want to come along?" It's very interesting because Dorothy Day never really cared much about women having the right to vote. She never voted in her life, and she used to say, "Women will vote for war just as much as men." So it wasn't really her issue, but she went with her friend, and she got beat up just like her friend. She got thrown in jail just like her friend, and she went on hunger strike just like her friend. This is kind of a famous action. It ended with President Wilson pardoning the women, and the jailer came in and said, "Ladies, you're going to go home to cook Thanksgiving dinner for your families, thanks to a presidential pardon." And they were really mad because they're like, "We've done nothing wrong. We don't need a pardon." Then Dorothy goes back to New York, and she's working as a freelancer, and she starts to hang out with a different crowd. And that's Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, right there. You notice there's no flat screen TVs up in these bars. People in Dorothy's group would perform for each other. And Eugene O'Neill was famous for, he would asked again and again to recite this poem, "The Hound of Heaven." Does anyone remember that? It's about someone being chased by a big dog who is God. So it's someone who's being chased by God, hounded by God, you might say. And Eugene O'Neill used to describe himself as an atheist, but then he'd recite this poem constantly about someone being pursued by God. And that was one of the interesting things about working, and studying these old radicals, is there's all these atheists who are obsessed with God, and just think about Dorothy in that context. Dorothy is, today's language might be she's spiritual but not religious. She thinks, she's 19 years old. She thinks religion's the opiate of the masses, but after staying up late with this crowd, she's going to mass in Greenwich Village afterwards. What's going on there? So I found that so interesting. The cartoonist, the cartoon editor for the magazine, used to say, Dorothy Day would make a terrible communist because she's always cornering you at a party and wanting to talk about God. So when you hear that whole thing of, Dorothy Day lived a bohemian lifestyle before she found Christ, it's not as simple as that. One of the things we hope to do with this book is draw a line between the young Dorothy and the Dorothy Day who's on that prayer card. How did that person become who she is? And so she ends up having kind of a falling out with this group. There's an overdose. One of the young men who she'd hang out with at the bar, he got dumped by his girlfriend, and he drinks heroin at a table and just drops dead in Dorothy's arms. And after she's kind of talking to him as he's dying, and she looks up, and everybody's gone, except for the sister of the guy who owns the bar. Everybody ran. Even this is a high school classmate of Eugene O'Neill's, and he's gone. And she cornered him at one point and said, "Where were you?" She said, "It's not." He says, "It's not my mess." It's kind of callous. And so she was like, all these people who stayed up late talking about building a better world, one of their own dies and they just run. So it was a real trauma for her. And we kind of switched to a blue palette for a while. And she says, "You know what? I'm done talking about building a better world. I'm going to become a nurse because it's the pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, that other pandemic that we all learned about." And she becomes a nurse, and she ends up falling in love with a fast-talking journalist who, he had a lot of big ideas about himself. It was sort of like one of those a self-made man who worshipped his creator. He used to say that he had taught this young reporter at the Kansas City Star everything he knew about writing, and that person was Ernest Hemingway. So this is like big-headed guy, but it's kind of funny because all Lionel's style is a lot like Hemingway's. So Hemingway learned something from him, but I don't know if he learned everything about writing. Dorothy becomes pregnant in this relationship, and Lionel, like a lot of men, says, "It's either me or the baby. You have to make a choice." So she has an abortion, and Lionel's not even there afterwards like he promises. And Dorothy, in her later years, told a confidant, I had to make a choice between Lionel and the baby, and I lost both of them. So it really hurt her a lot, and she went into a deep depression. There's 2 suicide attempts. This is a very difficult time in her life. If you ever read The Long Loneliness, there's this line in there that I guess it was written when people got away with this, but she says, of this period, 3 years, there is not much to say. And then she just moves on. She doesn't talk about it. It's too painful. Now, when I do this presentation to college and high school, I always give them a little advice. I always say, look, if you ever date somebody who's a writer, don't do them wrong, because they will write a revenge novel. Dorothy writes a revenge novel called The 11th Virgin. The New York Times calls it an adolescent novel. But, hey, I've written a bunch of books, and the New York Times never reviewed any of them. She earns a bit of money from it, and then Hollywood purchases the movie rights for it to make a silent movie out of this thing. And no copies still exist. You can get the book. The book is public domain now, so anybody can publish it. But here's a line from it. "It's physically impossible for a woman to take a man. She always gives herself up. And now I hate you. I don't want you because I feel everything going out of me to you. The thought of you eats into me continually." So, you feel that pain there. So a friend of hers says, "Dorothy, you got $2,500 from Hollywood for this. I know how you are with money. This is just all going to disappear. Buy a house. You'll always have that. And she buys a house on Staten Island. And Staten Island used to look like that, you know, like it used to be very beautiful. It was kind of like Cape Cod, you know, where I live now. And she meets this young, very much very much a nature boy. His name is Foster. It's spelled Forster, but his name's Foster. And they fall in love. And with this romance, it's more shared experiences than listening to the brilliant man talk about how brilliant he is. And Dorothy really falls for Foster, and she ends up becoming pregnant again. And she thought she had had some terrible complications from the abortion. She thought she'd never have a child. So she felt so grateful to God that she could have children after all. And she says, oh, I want to have the baby baptized. She's done being spiritual but not religious. Now she wants to be spiritual and religious. I want to join a church, and I'm going to join the Church of the Poor, the Catholic Church, the Church of the Immigrants, the Church of the Workers. And she gets Tamar baptized, but Foster is very upset about this. He says, you know, religion's against his principles. And Dorothy says, and by the way, we have to get married. I can't live with you like this. I mean, they're living together. She had this long loneliness. She has this quaint expression, my common law husband. And I don't know when common law kicks in when you're living with your boyfriend, but I don't know if it was immediate like that. But anyway, she has to kick him out. And, you know, he stays involved. You know, you read Dorothy's writings, and sometimes you think, like, he just disappears. But he was in the picture. He did pay, you know, money to support Tamar, and was involved as a father and then later as a grandfather. But he and Dorothy break up. Time jump to 1932. Dorothy has now tried to be Catholic and radical for 5 years. And she's having a hard time with it. She says, you know, I go to church and the priest never talks about the plight of workers. You know, sort of like, I never hear any sermons on social justice. You know, I never hear any homilies about the poor. You know, it's funny. I've heard that too. The experience too, she says, I don't even have a single Catholic friend. So she kind of tries to be in both worlds by covering the radical movements for the Catholic press. And you can go to America and Commonweal's websites, and you can actually read these articles that she wrote about the Hunger March of 1932. Which was organized by communists. And so the painful part for her is, where are the Catholics? Where are the Catholics? Don't we care about this too? And so she walks around D.C. afterwards, just trying to sort all this out. And she goes to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, and it's under construction. That's why you see the scaffolding there. But the basement church has been built. So she goes down and prays. And I think this is sort of a vocational prayer. She prays, you know, here I am, Lord. Help me use the gifts that you gave me for my fellow workers and the poor. You know, she's saying, like, here I am. I mean, many of us, I think, have had that moment where you say, you know, God, you made me like this. Help me be who you made me to be. And she prays, sheds a few tears, gets on a bus, and travels back to New York, where her sister greets her and says, Tamar, her daughter, has the measles, and there's this odd Frenchman who wants to talk to you. Peter Morin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. He says, we need to start a movement together. And you know, she's just gotten home from a long bus trip, and there's this guy saying, let's start a movement together. She says, well, let's talk another time. And he says, okay, I'll be back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And he's there, and he says, you know, people keep telling me that we think alike. And I think we can start a movement together. And by the way, I think you know your scripture, but you know nothing about the saints or Catholic teaching of the popes. So I will be your teacher. He becomes her self-appointed teacher. And a lot of this rings true with Dorothy. And you can see a little bit of Peter's speaking style. He's trying to convert the doctor to his ideas. Says, that is why we must fire the bosses. And the doctor's just trying to take care of a sick kid there. So Peter has this odd communication style where he basically keeps talking until you give up and agree with him. Maybe we know people like that in our lives, but so, and for us, we had a choice, which we decided to split the difference of, is he a comic character or is he a visionary? Here we have the visionary Peter Morin saying, we're going to start a movement and we're going to have a newspaper. We're going to have houses of hospitality like in the Middle Ages. We're going to help people who are hungry at the houses. We're going to have roundtable discussions where we'll work out the issues of the day, where everyone will be an expert on it. And then we're going to have farms where we'll farm by day and our produce we'll send down to the houses of hospitality. And at night, we'll read the poetry we write to each other. Be a little like that bar room with Eugene O'Neill, where we'll share our scholars will be workers and workers will become scholars. It's very idealized, but it's also really appealing. And for Dorothy, it's like, I forget that movie, You Had Me at Hello. For Dorothy, it's You Had Me at Newspaper. She came to New York to be a newspaper. And now this guy is saying, we're going to publish a newspaper. So she's going to be an editor and a publisher too. So she's hooked. She says, oh, let's do it. Let's make it happen. So the Catholic Worker, you can see on the right there, the circulation of the newspaper. Peter said it was going to be called the Catholic Radical. But Dorothy thought the Daily Worker, the communist paper, it would be good to have a Catholic counterpart. It's the Catholic Worker. So you wonder, who are these Catholic workers? Like people working in soup kitchens? No, it's a bit of a pun and a dig at the communists. We're here too. We care about workers. And the circulation when it starts is 20,000. Within 5 years, they're up to almost 200,000. So it's tremendous growth for a newspaper. And the reason is it's the Depression, and a lot of Catholics feel like what's happening here with capitalism is not working for us. But we're not going to become communists. Is there something else? And the Catholic Worker provides that. You can be Catholic and care about the poor and promote unions as a way of workers to have some power. So it grows tremendously. I always like to tell this story about the Sisters of Bethany. They were sisters who, they were composed of women who, at the time, were called reformed prostitutes. Today, we would call them human trafficking survivors. And they would help women escape from their pimps and put them in safe houses. And Dorothy provided housing for a number of them, and the Sisters of Bethany would buy the beds. And then Dorothy would stash women secretly in different parts of the city. Some of them would actually join the order, and others would transition to a more normal life. But I thought that was a really neat part of the story that often doesn't get told. Dorothy gets strong into covering the strikes of the day. These folks are actually striking as John D. Rockefeller, and you see what happens in 1937 if you strike against the richest man in the world. The Chicago police come and beat you up and shoot you. Again, some people are worried about the direction of the company. This is less than 100 years ago this was going on. She, throughout the 1950s, she got involved in the civil rights movement. She covered the situation of Koinonia Farm in Georgia, which was a Christian interracial community, very much ahead of its time. They used to sell their produce throughout Georgia, but the people started boycotting them during the civil rights movement, who had been their customers. And Dorothy volunteers for the night shift. About 1 or 2 in the morning, a truck comes by and starts shooting at the station wagon they're in. And I'd be talking to you about the martyr Dorothy Day if she hadn't ducked quickly enough. The woman she was with immediately. This is a Baptist woman who, they were going to stay up all night, so she brought her accordion, and she taught Dorothy Baptist hymns, and Dorothy taught her Liturgy of the Hours. And there were some Benedictines in Congers, Georgia, and so Dorothy timed, the night prayer to go with what they were doing at the monastery. So it was this great ecumenical exchange that ended up being, ended by bullets. So throughout the 1950s, she traveled a lot by Greyhound bus. That was how she got around. And Tamar, she always left Tamar in the care of couples in the Catholic worker whom she trusted. And I remember, I was really scared we'd find out something bad happened to Tamar or something. But apparently, Dorothy's an amazing judge of character. There's nothing like that. And, Tamar actually late in her life used to talk about the cool babysitters she had, which were Catholic workers. And so Dorothy, everything from lecturing at Yale Law School to visiting prisoners on death row in Philadelphia, interviewing sharecroppers in Mississippi to tell their story, and learning about worker-owned businesses. She was really into this idea in the 1950s of distributism, which is the idea that capitalism's really good at producing wealth. Maybe the people who do all the work should get more of it. So worker-owned businesses are one way of doing that, and the church still helps fund those. She did get in one. People often ask, well, what was her relationship with the cardinal archbishops of New York? And generally okay, except in 1949, she got in a big fight with Cardinal Spellman over the cemetery workers went on strike in 1949. They wanted a 5-day work week instead of a 6-day work week. Can you believe that? And he said, Cardinal Spellman said, no. And by the way, you're all a bunch of communists. You're all fired. And so they kept picketing, and the coffins began to pile up. So the cardinal decided to close the seminary and bring in the seminarians as grave diggers. And they came in as scabs. And I did this in New York about 2 months ago, and there was a guy whose father had been a gravedigger and had been in on the strike. And he said that when he died, they wouldn't let him be buried in a Catholic cemetery because he was a communist. And he wasn't. He was just a guy who wanted a 5-day work week. That eventually got tried to say, well, did that ever change? Like, where is he now? They said, yeah, eventually, long after Spellman, we got him moved back there. But he also told me a story about there was a gravedigger whose son was a seminarian. So imagine you're on the picket line and your son crosses to be a scab. That was hard. And the son felt like he didn't have a choice. He'd get thrown out of the seminary. So this was a big fight. And Cardinal Spellman and Dorothy had a very weird relationship because he thought she was a total pain. But I've just learned from talking to some priests of that era, or just after that era, and doing a little bit of research on the chancellor who became Cardinal McIntyre in Los Angeles. There's this Encyclopedia of California Catholicism, which I didn't know there was one, but I got it, and I got the article about Cardinal McIntyre, and I was reading it, and they said he was friends with Dorothy Day, but he didn't like what she was doing. He didn't like what she was doing, but he was afraid she might be a saint. And so what I learned from this is that, I don't know if you had this training, Monsignor, it's like there are certain people that are going to drive you crazy, and maybe you think that they shouldn't be allowed to be doing what they're doing, and maybe you don't like them, and don't be too hard on them if they are following, the faith, because they might be saints. And so that was just such an interesting thing where the FBI, like we got Dorothy's FBI file, which is 367 pages long. And every decade, somebody says she's a communist and a tool of the Russians. Even one says she was born in Russia. You have her birth certificate. She's born in Brooklyn. But she had this strange relationship where the FBI would investigate her, and they eventually would talk to the chancellor or the cardinal, and they would always say, she's a pain, but she's well-intentioned. I mean, even to the point where J. Edgar Hoover called Cardinal Spellman late in his time in New York, and he vouched for her. It's interesting because J. Edgar Hoover had her on a list of people to be rounded up during World War II when Roosevelt was ready for Phase 2. Phase 1 was a Japanese internment. Phase 2 would be round up all the dissidents and put them in camps, which sounds like our opponents in the war, actually. So there's this heroic side of Dorothy that is being there with the poorest of the poor and getting arrested and all that. But Robert Ellsberg, who's almost like a literary executor of Dorothy, he says, at the end of the day, it's her following the little way of Saint Therese. Like, some of us are called to great deeds that will be remembered throughout the centuries, but most of us are called to little things like changing diapers and cutting the carrots for the soup that night at the soup kitchen. And for Robert, that's the holiness of Dorothy Day. And people used to come in the 1970s and sort of worship her, of like Dorothy Day, living saint. You read it in Time magazine. We sent a Time magazine that has living saints, and Mother Teresa's on the cover, and Dorothy's in the interior with the B-level saints. And at the end of the day, this is the saintliness of Dorothy Day. In the 1960s, and so a lot of the people who are alive today knew Dorothy during the 60s, where she mentored all of these anti-Vietnam War activists, and to talk about what a great mentor she was and how caring she was. And she would challenge people, but it was always after she had developed a great, strong relationship with them. She didn't care for, I have to say this the right way, because I know some people think I've overstated this, but there were hippies that would drive her bananas. This is in her diaries about these people that come, stay at the house, don't do any work, get the girls pregnant, use drugs. Those are her words from her diary. So there were some people, if people were actually working on anti-war and mop the floor and cut the carrots for the soup, she really liked them and mentored them. But it was a little bit like the Beats. Like, she liked Allen Ginsberg, but the rest of them she really thought were problematic. Her last arrest was with the United Farm Workers. You may have seen a photo version of this, where the sheriff's deputies are surrounding this frail old woman. There's a whole bunch of them, and their guns are in the foreground. And she's there in her cane chair. But she was so inspired by Cesar Chavez, she felt like she had to. She was friends with Mother Teresa, and this was a story one of the longtime Catholic workers at Mary House told me, where Mother Teresa was there, and a guest came up to her and said, "You got a cigarette?" And she says, "No, I don't smoke." Says, "Then what good are you?" Probably. This is the guest? Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay. So people will tend to do what they always did. I want to just say a few words about the sainthood process, and we'll do a little Q&A. Dorothy currently, this right here, it says Servant of God, Dorothy Day. If you didn't get one, we can get you one too. These are the free things here. The books are for sale, but you can get this for free. Servant of God, it means she's an official candidate for sainthood. And Cardinal O'Connor of New York, at Dorothy's 100th birthday, gathered people who knew her and said, "I don't know what to do here. Because some people, she said, 'Don't call me a saint,' and all that. Like, should we move forward with having her canonized, or should we just leave well enough alone? And an interesting guy, too. He had been archbishop for the military services, and then he's thinking about nominating a pacifist, you know. So he's interesting, nuanced guy. The group, the unanimous consensus is yes, let's do that. He completes the paperwork, which isn't too heavy duty. It's not like the cause itself. Small biography, a little bit about why it's important. Sends it to the Vatican. Nothing happens for 3 years, not even knowing like what's going on. So Cardinal O'Connor gets brain cancer and he's dying. And he gets out of his deathbed and flies to Rome and has 3 wishes for Pope John Paul II. The first is that his priest secretary be made an auxiliary bishop. Done. Second, Dorothy Day be put on the path to sainthood. Done. Third, that Edward Egan will not be his successor at the Archdiocese of New York. The Pope says, I got you 2 out of 3. So, but that was why Dorothy in 2000 got on the track to sainthood, why that moment happened. So Cardinal Egan comes in, and his job is to clean up the finances. So it's not that he's, you know, a terrible guy or, you know, didn't like Dorothy or anything, but he had other fish to fry. So he does that for his years, I think 5 years. And then Cardinal Dolan comes, and he's kind of dusting all this stuff off and says, Dorothy Day is such a great story. You know, a story of conversion, a story of someone fighting for working people, you know, working for peace. You know, we should move her cause forward. So he's the first to invest money into it in the form of hiring somebody to do all the stuff that needs to get done. And I was lucky to be that person. And, you know, just to go over a few things that have to be done. We have to get testimonies of people who knew her. We had 35 testimonies under oath. 2 theologians read all of her published writings. So imagine that. This is a writer who had her own newspaper. A lot of writings there. Tens of thousands of pages. All diaries and important letters have to be transcribed. So she had a 10,000-page diary. It wouldn't, you know, that's like loose. You know, sometimes it's a shoebox full of loose paper. Sometimes it's a little volume that says diary on it. You know, it's all her diary as far as we're concerned. It's in terrible handwriting. Like anybody who tells you, like in the olden days, they had really good handwriting. I don't know how far back you have to go, but not, you know, from 1932 to 1980 for sure. So we had to have all this transcribed. We had 125 volunteers. Testimonies of bishops. We had, you know, about 30 bishops give their testimony as to why they think she should be a saint. And then additional supportive material. Well, the whole question is, did she live a life of heroic virtue? I used to think we were producing a report for the Vatican. We were compiling evidence for a trial. That's what we were doing, evidence for a trial. And the trial is not, is she guilty or innocent? It's, did she live a life of heroic virtue? And those, of course, were the 7 virtues. I'm going to skip right to the extra stuff we sent. Anyone recognize this fella here on the right? Anybody? Who's that? Batman, right. Quick story about Batman. Do you remember the TV show, you know, Batman? It turned Batman, it earned a lot of money, but it turned Batman into a national joke. And think about it. This is a kid, as a child, who sees his parents murdered in front of him by a criminal and decides he's going to spend the rest of his life fighting crime. I mean, skip the comic book part. It's like, what kind of person would that be? And how wounded would they be? And how dark would they be? And so a young writer, 25-year-old guy, Denny O'Neil, is given the job kind of make Batman dark again. And he does a really good job of it. And he's living in New York. Imagine this. This guy's writing comic books. He's 25 years old. He's making lots of money. He's writing Batman. and he's hanging out at the Catholic Worker. And he's listening to this woman named Dorothy Day talk about nonviolence and talk about the need to solve our problems without violence. And he's starting to think, and I write a very violent comic book. Oh, and it starts nagging at him. It's a little bit like, Herod. He's disturbed by John the Baptist, but he liked to listen to him. That's in there too. He liked to listen to him. So Dorothy Day's getting inside Denny O'Neil's head, and he's starting to wonder, should I quit? Well, someone else is just going to do the violent. And so he says, I'm going to introduce a character that'll be the conscience of Batman, and she'll be modeled after Dorothy Day. And so he introduces Dr. Leslie Tompkins, who mentored the young Bruce Wayne and helped him through his grief. And she knows Batman's secret identity. So she talks to Bruce. I saw what you did yesterday. You shouldn't be solving your problems with violence. And here's I think this one. Batman says, "You and those like you, you're the hope of Crime Alley. Maybe the only hope our tormented civilization has left." I think that's Denny O'Neil talking to Dorothy Day as much as anything. So she becomes a model for a character in Batman. And, in the 1990s, long after Denny O'Neil had left, he died just a couple years ago, and I got to interview him. So I have somewhere on this computer, I have an interview where he talks about all this. And let's see, Denny O'Neil. Okay, so in the 90s, she chastises him for putting Robin in such danger and threatens to report him to Department of Social Services because he's his ward. And I remember it's like an 8-year-old reader's like, what's this guy taking this little kid into these battles with supervillains and stuff? But yeah, she saw through it. There's also, and this is a little bit less well documented, but anybody a fan of classic Star Trek with like Kirk and Spock and all that? Yeah, we got a few. Okay. Do you remember City on the Edge of Forever, where the Enterprise goes through some space-time anomaly, and they're circling over a planet that seems a lot like Earth, and they go down there, and the Nazis control everything. And that's the one where they are in disguise as Nazis, and Spock says to Kirk, "I think you'd make an excellent Nazi, Captain." And he's like, well, they get Joan Collins to play a woman who runs a soup kitchen in New York City who is an absolute devotee of nonviolence, creates a movement that prevents the U.S. entry into World War II until it's too late. And the Nazis win World War II. So in some ways, it's a critique of Dorothy Day, but it's also an homage because they modeled this character after her and then got lovely Joan Collins to play her in the show. So you can see how Dorothy Day's captured a lot of people's imaginations in ways that, maybe people, it's kind of begin to be lost in history. Like nobody ever says, "Oh yeah, I remember that in Batman," that or that episode. Only one person has said, "Oh yeah, that's definitely Dorothy Day. I read that on Wikipedia. I looked it up." So Dorothy Day, servant of God. Any questions, comments, challenges? Yes. Oh, and let me get you a microphone. So we want to hear what y'all have to say too. And is this working? Yeah. Okay.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Dorothy was born to 2 Protestant parents.
Yes.
What was her epiphany moment, and I couldn't find anything in the research that I have, when she became Catholic? That's the first part.
Yeah.
Second part is she became a member of the Benedictine Oblates.
Yes.
What led her to that group?
Yeah, great
'Cause
question.
she was around a lot of them.
Great question. Let's start with why Catholic. She was born into, what we might say a culturally Episcopal family, where they thought, oh, we should get the baby baptized. and then do nothing to nurture the spiritual life ever. And John Day, I just get the sense he was probably, when you think of sports writers back in the day, hard drinking, who knows what with other women when he was traveling. Grace, her mother, after he died, Dorothy said, "Do you think Pop's in heaven?" And she said, "I hope not." Oh, okay. Thanks, Mom. So, I think there wasn't a lot of religious language. I think her mom had instincts to help people that had a big influence on Dorothy. And she had, it's just like kids today. She had sleepovers. And she'd be at people's house, and Saturday night and Sunday morning, they'd bring her to the Methodist church. So she had little experiences here and there. And one time she walked, she was walking by one of the parents' room where she was doing a sleepover, and she saw the mom kneeling and praying. And, when that's not part of your life, that made a big impression on her. And she had this other memory of reading a Bible up in the attic and just finding the words very powerful. And when she was arrested on the suffrage, the only book that was allowed was the Bible. And she was reading the Psalms, and she found them very comforting. So, the Benedictine Oblate part, who knows if the Psalms were part of that. But she had this sense that the Catholic Church was the church of the poor, but also that there was beautiful art in Catholic churches. So when she would, after being out with the gang at the Hellhole with Eugene O'Neill, and she'd go to Mass in Greenwich Village at St. Joseph's the next morning, it was a Catholic church for those reasons. It's a church of the poor, and it's a church with a lot of art. She was sacramental in that way. And the Benedictine Oblate, I'm actually a Benedictine Oblate too, with my monastery in St. Benedict, Louisiana, near where I grew up. And it's a commitment to a life of prayer, work, and study. A lot like what Peter Morin was envisioning. So it kind of gave her something to connect her to other people who were committed to prayer, work, and study. And she chose St. Procopius in Lisle, Illinois, because of their commitment to working with the Orthodox Church. Because she did not join the Orthodox Church, but she was a big fan of Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov and the character of Father Zosima, who, anyone read the Brothers Karamazov? All 1,200 pages? Oh, because of Dorothy? Yeah. Yeah. Father Zosima, he, just briefly, he was a character in the Brothers Karamazov, and he is approached by a wealthy woman who says, I've lost my faith. How can I get it back? And he says, through a life of service. But then he cautions her and says, but love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. He's basically saying it's not rainbows and unicorns. Any of us who have ever worked in a soup kitchen, worked with mentally ill people, worked with addicts, had addicts in our family, it's a harsh and dreadful love. And so she never forgot Father Zosima, and when she became a Benedictine Oblate, she wanted to be close to the Orthodox Church in some way as a Catholic. So that's why she chose St. Procopius. And St. Procopius has been very generous with the cause. They very much claim her, and Benedictine Oblates claim her. So, someone else? Yeah, me. First and then you.
So I don't know if I missed this.
Oh, is that on?
I don't know if I missed this, but did the daughter pass away from measles? If not, what happened to her?
No. She grew up, and she had 9 children. So Dorothy had 1 child and 9 grandchildren. And it was interesting. This is a whole other thing, but the historian Jill Lepore wrote a book. It's called The Secret History of Wonder Woman, and it's very, very good. And she covers the whole Margaret Sanger's family is involved in all this, and Margaret Sanger's niece was the secret second wife of the creator of Wonder Woman. It's a great story and everything. But she was saying, as she was doing the research, she found in the 1920s all these women's magazines with articles about balancing career and family. This is 1920s. You know, this is like first wave feminism. And she said, people like Margaret Sanger, when they got older, they felt really bad about being public people and not being present for their kids. And Dorothy didn't articulate a lot of this, but she was such a great grandmother that I wonder if there was some of that. Because, you know, at one point she put Tamar in boarding school because she wasn't around much. And so it was something that, you know, that when people who oppose Dorothy's canonization, there's not a lot of them, but there's a lot of schools of thought in there. Like some people oppose because she was a bad mom. Well, Tamar didn't think so, but she was a public person. You know, it's like when you hear Roseanne Cash talking about having Johnny Cash for a father, you know. He said, you know, I have my following, you know, I have fans, but my dad belonged to the world. And Dorothy Day was one of those people. So Tamar lived, I believe, until 2008. She had 9 children. Unfortunately, she married an alcoholic very young, and he wasn't a very good father, I think, being drunk a lot and having schizophrenic episodes. And so you can read a lot about that in Kate Hennessy's book, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, which is about both Dorothy and Tamar. So if you want to learn about Tamar, that's a great place. She actually wanted to write a book about her mom, and the publisher was like, you got to write a letter, but you got to write about both of them, because no one's going to buy a book about your mom. But they will buy a book about your grandma and your mom together. So, yeah, where's the microphone? Did I say? Oh, yeah, go ahead, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, you're next, right.
With the process to become a saint, you said there were 30 bishops? Do they actually know her?
No, this isn't about, like, the testimonies of the people who knew her, which is about what was she like, did she practice what she preached, you know, that kind of stuff. The bishops are about what would it mean for the church today for Dorothy Day to be a saint. Some of them have had expertise in her, so those people talked a lot more. But for a lot of them, it was just about, what does this mean for the church? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Okay. Oh, thank you. That's a servant leader. I'll tell you what.
2 more tag-on things that I'm really piqued with. Why is the Friday night meetings still going very strong? That's the first thing in New York. Second thing is why is the story of when Dan Berrigan, because I was with Dan Berrigan when he got out of jail, because he was in prison for 2 years, and the day to long story short, Dan Berrigan was another activist, but where Dorothy was a pacifist, Dan was even more of an extremist. And when Dan got out, he was given $50 from the prison. He headed right over to see Dorothy. And Dorothy said, I'm not touching it. So she sent one of the workers in the house down to her bedroom, and on her nightstand, she kept a bottle of holy water. I'm just bringing the story up because we were all getting our little bottles of holy water from the Jubilee year. And so when the young man brought the holy water back up, she told Dan, put the money in the holy water. She took it out and she says, now I'll take the money.
Great story. Anybody else? Yes.
What state did Dorothy pass away in, and where was she buried today?
Oh, that's a very important question about where did she die, because the diocese where the person died runs the sainthood whole question. So she died in New York. She died in Mary House, surrounded by a couple of her granddaughters, and Tamar. Yeah. And then what was the other part?
Where's she buried?
Oh, she's buried in Staten Island, which was in her will. I mean, I think she's shrewd enough to know the history of saints' bodies, and that some people considered her a saint, and she wanted her body to be in Staten Island. And Cardinal Dolan has had an interesting idea of moving her to the cathedral, but that requires the participation of the family. And it really varies. It's kind of an interesting family because you have like Martha Hennessy, who I believe might be coming here. No, often she makes the rounds, and I find like, oh, Martha Hennessy was just here. She's the like the activist gene landed in her as a granddaughter, and the writer gene got to Kate, who wrote that book, The World. You know, she had been like an accomplished travel writer and stuff. She didn't just say, hey, I want to write a book about my mom. She was like a professional writer. I'm sorry, oh, yeah. So they want to move her body to the cathedral. The family, I think Kate and Martha are willing to go along with it. A couple of the grandchildren are really, they've left the church and they're angry. And so they're just saying, no way. And then there's, I remember talking to one of her grandsons. Some of them are just kind of simple Vermont rural people who, like I remember talking to one of the grandsons. He was like, you want to do what with Granny? It was kind of like that, like, huh? It wasn't even like opposition. It was just like, why would you do that? But Cardinal Dolan would like to do a side altar in St. Patrick's Cathedral. People could learn about Dorothy Day, QR code to lead to all kinds of resources. So it would be a good thing, but it would be against her wishes. But then, she didn't want people to call her a saint either. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay. You
Just
first.
quickly, isn't there a Staten Island ferry now named after Dorothy
Oh,
Day?
yeah,
And how
yeah.
did
I'm
that
so
come about?
glad you said that. It's actually one of the only honorifics that people who knew her said she would have liked it. It's free. It's for workers to get to work. Like that would have been really a moment of pride for her. Yeah, go ahead.
So what has to happen for her to go to the next step to become venerable?
Well, let's go to the chart. Yeah, I have to say, just as someone who played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons when I was young, it's a little bit like D&D where you move up levels. She's currently servant of God. We want to get her to venerable soon. We sent 2/3 of a ton of paper to the Holy See on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in 2022. About 6 months later, we got a bill for the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints receiving these boxes. Okay, so we paid the bill. 4 months after that, we got a bill for them opening the boxes. So it was like, okay, all right, this is getting weird. We'll pay it, but Your Eminence, we got to keep an eye on this stuff. This is weird. And there's a little, Pope John the 23rd, in his first interview, the reporter, this is back when reporters were real nice, about, a new pope and everything. And they said, well, let's give him a softball question first. And the reporter has said, how many people work at the Vatican? And Pope John the 23rd says, about half. So, I just think of that whenever I think of this. And things kind of going into a black hole, and what's happening? And so I think it was October, a group of people, I no longer work for the cause, but I have so many, friends there and stuff, and I keep up with them. And they said that there was a real sense in the guild of urgency. Like, this thing is just going to sit there. You know, like Cardinal O'Connor had to like fly over from his deathbed to get things going. This is going to happen again. And so it went to Cardinal Dolan and said, you know, like, how do you move this? This is just stuck. And he is such a shrewd, like in the sense of politician, of politics as the art of the possible. He knows how to get things done. And so he writes a letter to Pope Francis and says, Holy Father, Dorothy Day is going to turn 126 next month. Would you give her a birthday present of assigning staff to her cause? A month later, this Monsignor's appointed. It's underway. He's asking real questions about real stuff. They need this, they need that. So stuff is happening now. If they were to really focus on it for a year, they could probably get all that evidence sorted through and give an opinion to the Holy Father about whether she should be Venerable Dorothy Day. Whether that'll happen or not, you know, people say, well, how long until she made saint? I always say, well, between 300 and 300 years. You know.
Jeff, the Carlos Acutis is going to be canonized on April 28th, a 15-year-old. How does the process for Dorothy Day compare with the process for him, or don't you have any knowledge of how that happened? But I mean, that was kind of very speedy.
Yeah, it helps if you didn't write anything down. I have a feeling that a young man had not published very many articles, didn't have his own newspaper, didn't publish books, didn't have a 10,000-page diary. You know, so these are a lot of things. Like people say, is it because Dorothy Day had an abortion? That no, it actually doesn't count against her at all. It starts when you become Catholic. Had she been born Catholic, it wouldn't even be considered. But converts, you know, and there's almost a joke about that. Like, I remember a colleague of mine saying, boy, you know, these saints, they sure lived holy lives after their conversions, but they sure had a lot of fun before that. You know, Augustine fathered a child out of wedlock, and, you know, I mean, there's some hard. Ma'am. Oh, use the microphone so they can hear you.
The footnote on this card has, maybe you could shed some more information about it, that if you receive a miracle through her intercession, to email this Monsignor. So I have never read anything like that. So maybe you could just shed some more info.
What we did at the Guild was ask people to pray for their needs and tell us what happened. Like, not say people, if you get a miracle, please call, you know, please dial this, you know, like just 1-800-MIRACLE or something like that. Like, it just felt weird. So we just tell people, you know, tell us whatever you prayed for, if you got it, and then we'll figure out these are miracles. And we had a couple that were really interesting when in the 7 years I was there. One person said, and you know, y'all are close enough to New York, you understand this. Somebody said, I prayed to Dorothy Day that I would find a free parking space in Manhattan, and I did. And you know, it's fair enough, but the thing is, there's such a thing as a miracle trial, where there will be a trial to determine, is there any other explanation for this? Well, you know, somebody got out of their house and drove to work. You know, that's a good explanation. You got lucky, you know. So that's one miracle. Another one was actually much more, you know, powerful. Someone said, I had a tumor in my arm, and I was supposed to have a biopsy a week later. And so I prayed that this tumor would go away to Dorothy Day. And when they went to do the biopsy, they couldn't find a tumor. So there's evidence in the scan, you know, it's like an x-ray or something. So it's there, and there's the doctor who can swear that it was that. And then there's no tumor. So that is very, very powerful. And then as I'm writing all this information down, what's the name of your doctor, you know, all that, they say, does it matter that I also prayed to Sister Thea Bowman? It's just, oh man, yeah, it does. So, but thank you so much. I'm going to stay and sign the books, and there's some neat things. There's the story of what happened when Dan Berrigan presided over Mass with a coffee cup instead of a chalice. There's two competing versions of the story, so we present them both. And a lot of other fun stories that are not in other books, because we interviewed so many people who haven't published these things or found them in archives that people hadn't seen. We even discovered publications that no one knew that she had. So thank you so much for having me.
And Jeff, if I may, on behalf of